We take it for granted that we understand the ancient world. Museums catalog it, textbooks explain it, experts date it. But what if some of the most important objects ever created refuse to fit the explanations we've assigned them? What if statues, busts, and figurines carved thousands of years ago possess qualities that shouldn't have been possible? Technical mastery, artistic vision, and symbolic depth that challenge the very timeline of human civilization. Scattered across the world's greatest museums and archaeological sites are four objects that archaeologists and historians keep returning to. Not because they are merely beautiful, though they are, but because they raise questions that no one has fully answered. Questions about who made them, how, and why. Today, we're examining four of the most mysterious artifacts ever recovered from the ancient world, and the secrets they may still be hiding. The faces that shouldn't exist. In 1983, a construction crew working on the outskirts of Amman, Jordan, broke through a layer of compacted earth and found themselves staring into a pit that had been sealed for 9,000 years. Inside, partially collapsed but miraculously intact, were two large human figures, not carved from stone or cast from metal, but built up from layers of lime plaster applied over bundles of reeds, shaped and smoothed by hands working in the Neolithic period, roughly 7000 BCE. These were the Ain Ghazal statues, and they would force archaeologists to completely reconsider what early humans were capable of creating. What made the discoveries so unsettling wasn't just their age, it was their faces. Wide, staring eyes inlaid with bitumen pupils, noses carefully modeled with a sculptor's precision, mouths set in expressions that felt to those who excavated them uncomfortably human. These weren't crude approximations of people, they were portraits. They conveyed presence. Standing nearly a meter tall, they looked back at the researchers who uncovered them with an intensity that made the distance of 9 millennia feel suddenly very small. The technical achievement was staggering. Lime plaster of this kind requires controlled burning of limestone at precise temperatures, a sophisticated pyrotechnical process that demands real understanding of chemistry and fire management. The builders of Ain Ghazal had mastered this process at a time when most of the world's human population still lived nomadically, following herds across open landscapes. These people were building permanent settlements, farming the land, and creating monumental sculpture. 32 figures were eventually recovered from two separate caches at the site, the largest collection of prehistoric statuary ever found in the Near East. Some had two heads, some were busts, others full figures. All had been ritually buried, not discarded, but deliberately placed underground with apparent care and ceremony. Researchers have debated what this burial means ever since. Representations of gods? Ritual objects used in ceremonies we can no longer reconstruct? The Ain Ghazal statues now reside in the collections of the Jordan Museum in Amman and the Smithsonian in Washington. They are the oldest large-scale statues ever discovered, and the questions they raise about the origins of art, religion, and symbolic thinking remain as open as those ancient bitumen-dark eyes. Second, the lady who looks through you. Workers digging near the town of Elche in southeastern Spain began unearthing fragments of painted limestone. When the pieces were assembled, they revealed a bust of a woman so refined, so technically accomplished, so startlingly modern in its aesthetic, that archaeologists initially refused to believe it was as old as the surrounding stratigraphy suggested. The Lady of Elche, as she would come to be known, dated to the 4th or 5th century BCE, created by an Iberian civilization that most of Europe had never heard of. She looked like she belonged in classical Athens. She had apparently never left Spain. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Her face was carved with a realism that placed her in a tradition typically associated with Greek sculpture. Smooth skin, carefully observed bone structure, an expression of calm intelligence that has captivated everyone who has stood before her for over a century. But it was her headdress that made archaeologists stop and reconsider everything. Flanking her face were two enormous wheel-shaped coils, called rhodes, a type of ornament worn by elite Iberian women of the period. They are magnificent and strange, loaded with cultural specificity, unmistakably local. She was both entirely of her time and place, and impossibly sophisticated for what we thought that time and place could produce. The Iberians were a pre-Roman people, about whom we know frustratingly little. They left behind a script that has never been fully deciphered, a material culture that blended indigenous traditions with Greek and Phoenician influences, and objects like the Lady of Elche that demonstrate mastery of stone carving equal to anything produced in the Mediterranean world. Adding to the mystery is the cavity discovered at the back of the bust. Hollow and sealed, it contains no inscription, no relic, no explanation. Theories have accumulated around it for decades, a container for votive offerings, a space for cremated remains, a cavity that once held pigments or precious materials now long dissolved. No one has produced a satisfying answer. The lady keeps her secrets with the same composed expression she has maintained for 2,500 years. She was taken to France after her discovery, lived in the Louvre for decades, and was eventually returned to Spain. She now stands in the National Archaeological Museum in Madrid, still drawing visitors who come to look at a face that somehow, across the full distance of 25 centuries, looks directly back. Third, the lioness at the edge of history. She is smaller than your fist. She weighs less than a paperback book. She is approximately 5,000 years old, carved from a deep reddish-brown limestone with a precision that modern sculptors openly admire. The Gwenal lioness was created somewhere in the ancient kingdom of Elam, in what is now southwestern Iran, between 3000 and 2800 BCE, in the earliest centuries of what we call recorded history. She is a standing figure, half human and half lion, her body held in a posture of absolute stillness that radiates, paradoxically, enormous energy. Her surface is worn smooth by centuries, perhaps millennia, of handling. Someone held this object repeatedly, turned it over in their hands, carried it close. The wear patterns suggest she was an object of devotion, or at minimum, of constant attention. Her face is rendered with a detail that seems impossible at this scale. Nostrils, brow ridges, the muscles of the jaw, a mouth slightly open, as though she's about to speak or snarl. Her hands, human in form, are carved with individual fingers. She stands upright, the way a person stands, but her head is entirely leonine. The Elamites who created her lived in one of the earliest complex urban civilizations on Earth, contemporaries of the Sumerians to their west, trading partners and rivals. Their art blended human and animal forms in ways that seemed to reach toward something beyond naturalistic representation, toward a symbolic vocabulary we have only partially decoded. The Gwenal lioness belongs to a small group of comparable figures from the same period and region, but she is regarded by scholars as the finest of them all. What did she mean to the people who made her? The lion was a potent symbol across the ancient Near East, associated with royalty, divine power, and the terrifying forces of nature that human civilization was always working to hold at bay. A lion woman might represent a goddess, a demon, a protective spirit, or something for which we no longer have a category. The Elamite writing system and religious texts survive only in fragments, leaving figures like the lioness isolated from the explanatory frameworks that once gave them meaning. In 2007, the Gwenal lioness sold at Sotheby's auction for over $57 million, the highest price ever paid for a sculpture at that time. She now resides in a private collection, occasionally loaned to museums. An object made by an anonymous craftsman 5,000 years ago, for purposes no one fully understands, became the most valuable sculpture ever auctioned. Even that fact raises questions that have no comfortable answers. The box buried beneath the kingdom. When archaeologists in the early 20th century began excavating the ruins of ancient Sumerian cities in what is now southern Iraq, they expected to find the kinds of artifacts that fill history books. Tablets inscribed with laws and accounts, pottery, jewelry, weapons. What they did not expect to find were sealed boxes buried deliberately beneath the foundations of temples and palaces. These foundation deposits were among the most intimate objects ever recovered from the ancient world. Messages from kings to the future, buried in darkness, never meant to be seen again by human eyes. The box of Ur-Nammu belongs to this tradition. Ur-Nammu was the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, who ruled around 2112 to 2095 BCE, and built the Great Ziggurat of Ur, one of the most impressive surviving structures of the ancient world. To consecrate his buildings, he followed a Sumerian practice of creating foundation deposits, sealed containers placed beneath cornerstones that held inscribed tablets, figurines, and objects of symbolic significance. The box associated with his name contained a cuneiform tablet inscribed with a dedication to the gods, affirming the king's piety and his right to rule. What makes this object extraordinary is not its material value, but its conceptual ambition. Ur-Nammu understood that buildings can collapse, empires can fall, and even the most powerful king will be forgotten. So he buried a message where he believed it would be safe, underground, beneath the weight of his own construction, addressed not to his contemporaries, but to whoever would one day dig down through the layers of his world and emerge into a future he could not imagine. He was writing to archaeologists who wouldn't exist for 4,000 years. The inscription followed a formula used across Mesopotamian foundation deposits, but within that formula was something that reads as genuinely personal. The king describes himself by his titles and lineage, names the temple he is building, names the god for whom he builds it, and asks for blessings in return. There is a quality to these texts that transcends their formality, a recognition that the present moment is temporary. That stone and inscription might outlast everything else, and that communication across unimaginable spans of time is at least worth attempting. Foundation deposits have been recovered from dozens of Mesopotamian sites, spanning centuries of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian rule. They form a kind of unbroken chain of voices speaking from beneath the ground. Kings and priests who understood that civilization is fragile and memory is precious, and who chose to bury their words in the only vault they had available to them, the earth itself. The box of Ur-Nammu sits at the beginning of that chain. When it was opened after 4,000 years in darkness, it said exactly what its maker intended it to say. Someone was listening. 4 objects. 4 civilizations separated by geography, language, and centuries, yet each of them reaches across the distance between their world and ours with a force that stops us in our tracks. The Ain Ghazal Statues ask us to reconsider the very origins of art and spiritual thought. The Lady of Elche shows us a civilization that flourished brilliantly and vanished, leaving behind more questions than answers. The Gwenal Lioness reminds us that the impulse to give form to something beyond the human is as old as civilization itself. And the box of Ur-Nammu tells us that even 4,000 years ago, a king lying awake in his palace understood that everything he had built would one day become rubble, and tried to speak through it anyway. Perhaps what these objects share is not mystery in a sensational sense, not the suggestion of lost technologies or forgotten powers, but something quieter and more profound. They share the evidence of minds fully engaged with the same questions we ask today. Who are we? What do we owe the gods or each other? What will survive us? How do we make something worthy of the brief time we have? The ancient world is not a simpler version of our own. It is a different world, populated by people as complex, as anxious, as creative, and as mortal as we are. These 4 objects prove it. They have been waiting a long time for someone to understand that.